Hello, welcome to the Shibori dye workshop. My name's Beth. I'm going to be showing you a Japanese method of dyeing fabrics today. And we're going to be using some basic hand stitch methods and some folding techniques to create some beautiful patterns on your fabrics. So the equipment that you're going to need today is a range of fabrics. I've got some calico fabric and I've got some pre-dyed calico as well, so I'm going to over dye that with a bit of extra colour. I've got a needle and thread. The thread's quite important because it's polyester and it's also an upholstery thread, so it's thicker and stronger than your regular sewing thread. The dye that I'm using is called Procyan. It's an indigo colour, but you could use a natural dye or a dye-lon mix, whatever you have. For the dye mixing, you're going to probably need some rubber gloves and maybe an apron, and obviously some sort of container to mix the dye in as well. So the first technique I'm going to show you involves a couple of folds and one row of stitching, and you get this pattern which is called orinoi, which means horse's teeth. So along the edges you get these little teeth appearing. And it's a really nice, simple, basic one to start with. So you need a length of cloth, and you're going to just do a few folds to start with. So fold it down the centre. You can press it with an iron as well, that's quite helpful to do if you've got an iron handy. So my fold's along here. I'm then going to fold one edge up and then turn it over and fold the other edge up. Okay, so you end up with a strip of fabric like that. Now, if I just lift that slightly, you can see there's two folds along that edge there. And this is the edge that we're going to do our sewing along. So you need your needle and thread, a length of thread that's going to ensure that you get along, the length of the fabric. And if you tie a knot in the end of your thread as well. So I'm just going to start a few millimetres in from the edge of my fold, and I'm going to do a running stitch, which is just up and down stitches. So if I go down in there, okay, if I just hold that so you can see. So I'm going to do that same process all the way along this edge. Okay, so now I've got a row of stitches along that bottom edge. You can do your stitches closer together, you can do longer stitches. All of these things will slightly vary the size of the horse's teeth that you get in your pattern. So you could start off with smaller stitches and go into bigger as a bit of an experiment to see what you like when you dye it. The next stage is to gather this up. Okay, so you're going to pull the thread from the end of your sewing, pull all those stitches together, and you're wanting to get it as tight as possible. You might need to just push them down a little bit towards that edge. What you end up with is like a little cuff or a little skirt sort of shape. And then at this stage, you're not going to knot this end yet. What you need to do first, which is really important, is to wet the fabric now. Because when the fabric's dry, it's quite springy and it springs and opens up, so it's much harder to get a tighter knot on the end. When the fabric's wet, you can compress it down and it will hold that form more easily because the fabric's wet. So you're going to wet this thoroughly, and then you're going to tie a knot in the end. The knot at the end needs to be as close to the fabric as possible. So you can double knot it or whatever you find easiest, but you're really pulling that fabric in and placing that final knot as close to here as possible. It should be quite difficult to open the pleats and see the colour of your thread. All right, so if this is loose and you can see lots of thread, it means your knot's not tight enough and you need to pull that down again and re-knot it. Okay, so the second stitch I'm going to show you is for a technique called karamatsu, which I think means the large. It's a nice bold design. You get these beautiful circular patterns and you can see some nice textures and detail where the fabric's been pleated and gathered together. Again, it's running stitches, so stitches going up and down through the fabric, and we also have one fold as well. So with your fabric, the first thing you're going to do is just fold that in half. Now if I turn mine over, you'll see I've done it with a little fabric marker pen. I've just marked little sections along that fold. So what you could do, this is to just make sure your stitches go evenly, is to measure your fabric out first. And I've just marked every 2 centimetres from the centre outwards. All right, so I know roughly where I need to start and where I need to get to. This will make more sense as we start to sew. So the first 2 I'm going to look at is the marks nearest the centre of the fabric. And I'm going to sew from this dot to this dot, but I'm going to go in an archway like a rainbow, and just little running stitches up and down. So my thread's got a knot at the bottom, and I'm going to gum in from the back of the fabric, and I'm going to do some small running stitches to create a little rainbow shape. When my stitch reaches the end there, I'm just going to let that thread hang loose off the edge. Okay, so I'm not going to tie a knot in it at this stage. What I'm going to do is get a new bit of thread and start from this side, and I'm going to repeat the process, create an archway like a rainbow, small running stitches over the top, and then I'm going to let the thread hang on this side here. I'm then going to do that again. So I end up with the same pattern repeating, getting slightly bigger each time. All my knots are on one side over here. All my loose ends are on the opposite side here. So what you should end up with, depending how big you want to go, is a piece of fabric that looks similar to this. Okay, so all my knots are on here. All my loose threads are on this side here. The next stage is to gather that up, just like we did with the first example. And what you're going to do is gather it up as much as you can while it's dry. And then you're going to wet and soak the fabric through, and then you're going to gather again so that you can get those knots really, really tight and as close to the fabric as possible. You want to be able to not be able to see the colour of the thread, if possible, when you sort of open the pleats up. So I'm going to just start to gather these. Pushing all the stitches along. So the reason we keep all the threads on one side is just so they don't get tangled together, and it's easier to knot from one side than going back and forth. So the last stitch method I'm going to show you is called a wrapping stitch. This one's really fast and really simple to do, hopefully. What you need to decide on first is a shape that you want to work within. So the top one, I've just drawn a simple leaf shape onto the fabric first. And the one I'm going to demonstrate now, I've just done a circle. I've drawn it with a fabric pen, but you could just really lightly do it in pencil or tailor's chalk if you've got anything like that. So the wrapping stitch goes side to side through the shape. So what you're doing is, I'm just going to get a starting point on the edge of the circle. So I've got a knot in the thread again at the bottom, and I'm just going to do a little stitch sort of next to each other, and then I'm going to come back to this side that I started, and I'm going to do another stitch from side to side. So I'm always touching the edge of the line that I've drawn, and I'm going back and forth with my thread. I've probably chosen quite a tricky one as a circle actually. So I'm going to go back to the left hand side, pull my thread tight, and then over to the right hand side. And then again to the left hand side, carrying the thread over every time. Okay, so what you'll start to get is something like this along your shape. Once you've done 3 or 4 stitches, it's a good idea to start to gather that. So rather than like the other samples, we gathered them at the end, this one you're going to gather as you go, else it becomes too tricky to gather right at the end. Okay, so what starts to happen is it pulls in and it starts to create these pleats in the fabric, and that's where you get these little marks from the pleating which are broken up with lines from your stitching. So I'm going to carry on side to side across the shape until I get right to the end. So you're going to mix up your dye bath now, or your natural dyes, and then you can add your fabrics, submerge them in the dye, and then I'm going to leave mine for about 40 minutes. So I'm just going to give them a little stir to make sure they're covered, and I'll probably give it a stir in 15 minutes or so to make it move around. Okay, I'll leave that for 40 minutes. So I've rinsed the dyes off now till the water ran clear, and now's the best bit where you get to open them up and see what patterns you've got underneath. So we'll start with horse's teeth. I'm just going to break the stitch. You can pull out your threads quite easily. You can see straight away there's some nice marks there. Hopefully when you've opened up your fabrics you've got lovely patterns and decoration just from your simple hand sewing techniques, creating all these different marks and patterns on your cloth. There's loads that can be done with shibori, and if you get into it you can just experiment with loads of different marks and stitches, try different scale or repeating patterns, stitching into them afterwards. There's loads of possibilities with it. So I hope you've learnt how to make some interesting marks and enjoyed having a go today.